The American Yawp, Chapter 4, British North America, Section 5, Riot, Rebellion, and Revolt. Violence was endemic in 17th century North America. Clashes from the northeastern New England colonies to the Spanish Empire in the southwest demonstrated how colonial expansion produced major conflict between Europeans and Native Americans, and within the colonies themselves. In New England, the Pequot War of 1637 devastated Pequot communities and provided the New England colonies with security and space for expanded settlements. But in the face of colonial expansion, the Narragansetts and Mohegans, who had been allies of the English against the Pequots, chose to side with the Wampanoags when war with the English broke out again a generation later. This produced a more violent conflict in 1675 known as King Philip's War, bringing a decisive end to Native American power in New England. In the winter of 1675, the body of John Sassamon, a Harvard-educated Christian Wampanoag, was found under the ice of a nearby pond. A fellow Native American convert informed English authorities that 3 warriors under the local sachem named Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, had killed Sassamon, who had previously accused Metacom of planning an offensive against the English. The 3 alleged killers appeared before the Plymouth court in June 1675. They were found guilty of murder and executed. Several weeks later, a group of Wampanoags killed 9 English colonists in the town of Swansea. Like most other New England sachems, Metacom had entered into covenants of submission to various colonies, viewing the arrangements as relationships of protection and reciprocity rather than subjugation. Native Americans and the English lived, traded, worshipped, and arbitrated local disputes with each other before 1675, but the execution of 3 of Metacom's men at the hands of Plymouth Colony epitomized what many Native Americans viewed as the growing inequality of that relationship. The Wampanoags who attacked Swansea may have sought to restore balance, or to retaliate for the recent executions. Neither they nor anyone else sought to engulf all of New England in war, but that is what happened. Authorities in Plymouth sprang into action, enlisting help from the neighboring colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts. Metacom and his followers eluded colonial forces in the summer of 1675, striking at more Plymouth towns as they moved northwest. Some groups joined his forces, while others remained neutral or supported the English. The war badly divided some indigenous communities. Metacom himself had little control over events as panic and violence spread throughout New England in the autumn of 1675. English mistrust of neutral Native Americans, sometimes accompanied by demands that they surrender their weapons, pushed many into the war. By the end of 1675, most of the Native Americans of present-day western and central Massachusetts had entered the war, laying waste to nearby English towns like Deerfield, Hadley, and Brookfield. Colonial forces, spurning the military assistance of allies such as the Mohegans, proved unable to locate the more mobile native communities or intercept attacks. The English compounded their problems by attacking the powerful and neutral Narragansetts of Rhode Island in December 1675. In an action called the Great Swamp Fight, 1,000 Englishmen put the main Narragansett village to the torch, gunning down as many as 1,000 Narragansett men, women, and children as they fled the maelstrom. The surviving Narragansetts joined those already fighting the English. Between February and April 1676, native forces devastated a succession of English towns closer and closer to Boston. The tide turned in the spring of 1676. The New England colonies took the advice of men like Benjamin Church, who urged the greater use of native allies, including Pequots and Mohegans, to find and fight the mobile warriors. As the combatants were unable to plant crops and forced to live off the land, their will to continue the struggle waned as companies of English and native allies pursued them. Growing numbers of fighters fled the region, switched sides, or surrendered in the spring and summer. Colonial forces finally caught up with Metacom in August 1676, and the sachem was slain by a Christian Native American fighting with the English. The war permanently altered the political and demographic landscape of New England. Between 800 and 1,000 English and at least 3,000 Native Americans perished in the 14-month conflict. Thousands of others fled the region or were sold into slavery. In 1670, Native Americans comprised roughly 25% of New England's population. A decade later, they made up perhaps 10%. The war's brutality also encouraged a growing hatred of all indigenous people among many New England colonists. Though the fighting ceased in 1676, the bitter legacy of King Philip's War lived on. 16 years later, New England faced a new fear, the supernatural. Beginning in early 1692 and culminating in 1693, Salem Town, Salem Village, Ipswich, and Andover all tried women and men as witches. Paranoia swept through the region, and 14 women and 6 men were executed. 5 other individuals died in prison. The causes of the trials are numerous and include local rivalries, political turmoil, the enduring trauma of war, faulty legal procedure where accusing others became a method of self-defense, or perhaps even low-level environmental contamination. Enduring tensions with Native people framed the events, however, and a Native American or African woman named Tituba, enslaved by the local minister, was at the center of the tragedy. Native American communities in Virginia had already been decimated by wars in 1622 and 1644. But a new clash arose in Virginia the same year that New Englanders crushed Metacom's forces. This conflict, known as Bacon's Rebellion, grew out of tensions between Native Americans and English settlers, as well as tensions between wealthy English landowners and poor settlers, many of them former indentured servants, who pushed west into territory controlled by Native Americans. Bacon's rebellion began, appropriately enough, with an argument over a pig. In the summer of 1675, a group of Doeg people visited Thomas Matthew on his plantation in northern Virginia to collect a debt that he owed them. When Matthew refused to pay, they took some of his pigs to settle the debt. This theft sparked a series of raids and counter-raids. The Susquehannock people were caught in the crossfire when the militia mistook them for Doegs, leaving 14 dead. A similar pattern of escalating violence then repeated itself. The Susquehannocks retaliated by killing colonists in Virginia and Maryland, and the English marshaled their forces and laid siege to the Susquehannocks. The conflict became uglier after the militia executed a delegation of Susquehannock ambassadors under a flag of truce. A few parties of warriors intent on revenge launched raids along the frontier and killed dozens of English colonists. The sudden and unpredictable violence of the Susquehannock War triggered a political crisis in Virginia. Panicked colonists fled en masse from the vulnerable frontiers, flooding into coastal communities and begging the government for help. But the cautious governor, Sir William Berkeley, did not send an army after the Susquehannocks. He worried that a full-scale war would inevitably drag other Native Americans into the conflict, turning allies into deadly enemies. Berkeley therefore insisted on a defensive strategy centered on a string of new fortifications to protect the frontier and strict instructions not to antagonize friendly Native people. The plan, however, only angered and terrified colonists. Building contracts for the forts went to Berkeley's wealthy friends, who conveniently decided that their own plantations were the most strategically vital. Colonists denounced the government as a corrupt band of oligarchs more interested in lining their pockets than protecting the people. By the spring of 1676, a group of frontier settlers took matters into their own hands. Naming the charismatic young Nathaniel Bacon as their leader, these self-styled volunteers proclaimed that they took up arms in defense of their homes and families. They took pains to assure Berkeley that they intended no disloyalty, but Berkeley feared a coup and branded the volunteers as traitors. Berkeley finally mobilized an army, not to pursue the Susquehannocks, but to crush the colonist rebellion. His drastic response catapulted a small band of angry settlers into full-fledged rebels, whose survival necessitated bringing down the colonial government. Bacon and the rebels stalked the Susquehannocks, as well as friendly Native Americans like the Pamunkeys and the Occaneechi. The rebels became convinced that there was a massive Native conspiracy to destroy the English. Berkeley's stubborn persistence in defending allied Native Americans and destroying the rebels led Bacon to accuse the governor of conspiring with a powerful cabal of elite planters, and with the protected and darling Indians to slaughter his English enemies. In the early summer of 1676, Bacon's neighbors elected him their burgess and sent him to Jamestown to confront Berkeley. Berkeley soon had Bacon arrested and forced the rebel leader into the humiliating position of publicly begging forgiveness for his treason. Bacon swallowed this indignity, but turned the tables by gathering an army of followers and surrounding the State House, demanding that Berkeley name him the General of Virginia and bless his universal war against Native Americans. Instead, the 70-year-old governor stepped onto the field in front of the crowd of angry men, unafraid, and called Bacon a traitor to his face. Then he tore open his shirt and dared Bacon to shoot him in the heart if he was so intent on overthrowing his government. "Here," he shouted before the crowd, "shoot me, before God, it is a fair mark. Shoot." When Bacon hesitated, Berkeley drew his sword and challenged the young man to a duel. Knowing that Bacon could neither back down from a challenge without looking like a coward, nor kill him without making himself into a villain. Instead, Bacon resorted to bluster and blasphemy. Threatening to slaughter the entire assembly if necessary, he cursed, "God damn my blood, I came for a commission, and a commission I will have before I go." Berkeley stood defiant, but the cowed burgesses finally prevailed upon him to grant Bacon's request. Virginia had its general, and Bacon had his war. After this dramatic showdown in Jamestown, Bacon's rebellion quickly spiraled out of control. Berkeley slowly rebuilt his loyalist army, forcing Bacon to divert his attention to the coasts and away from Native Americans. But most rebels were more interested in defending their homes and families than in fighting other Englishmen, and they deserted in droves at every rumor of native activity. In many places, the rebellion was less an organized military campaign than a collection of local grievances and personal rivalries. Both rebels and loyalists smelled the opportunities for plunder, seizing their rivals' estates and confiscating their property. For a small but vocal minority of rebels, however, the rebellion became an ideological revolution. Sarah Drummond, wife of rebel leader William Drummond, advocated independence from England and the formation of a Virginian republic, declaring, "I fear the power of England no more than a broken straw." Others struggled for a different kind of independence. White servants and enslaved black people fought side by side in both armies after Bacon's faction promised freedom for military service. The rebels steadily lost ground and ultimately suffered a crushing defeat. Bacon died of typhus in the autumn of 1676, and his successors surrendered to Berkeley in January 1677. Berkeley summarily tried and executed the rebel leadership in a succession of kangaroo courts-martial. Before long, however, the royal fleet arrived, bearing over 1,000 red-coated troops, and a royal commission of investigation charged with restoring order to the colony. The commissioners replaced the governor and dispatched Berkeley to London, where he died in disgrace. But the conclusion of Bacon's rebellion was uncertain, and the maintenance of order remained precarious for years afterward. The garrison of royal troops discouraged both incursion by Native Americans and insurrection by discontented colonists, allowing the king to continue profiting from tobacco revenues. The end of armed resistance did not mean a resolution to the underlying tensions destabilizing colonial society. Native Americans inside Virginia remained an embattled minority, and those outside Virginia remained a threat. Elite planters continued to grow rich by exploiting indentured servants and enslaved people while marginalizing small farmers. Virginia legislators did recognize the extent of popular hostility toward colonial rule, however, and improved the social and political conditions of poor white Virginians in the years after the rebellion. During the same period, the increasing availability of enslaved workers through the Atlantic slave trade contributed to planters' large-scale adoption of slave labor in the Chesapeake. Just a few years after Bacon's rebellion, the Spanish experienced their own tumult in the area of contemporary New Mexico. The Spanish had maintained control in the region in part by suppressing Native American beliefs. Friars aggressively enforced Catholic practice, burning native idols and masks and other sacred objects, and banishing traditional spiritual practices. In 1680, the Puebloan religious leader Pope, who had been arrested and whipped for sorcery 5 years earlier, led various Puebloan groups in rebellion. Several thousand Puebloan warriors razed the Spanish countryside and besieged Santa Fe. They killed 400 in the town, including 21 Franciscan priests, and allowed 2,000 other Spaniards and Christian Puebloans to flee. It was perhaps the greatest act of indigenous resistance in North American history. The Puebloans in New Mexico eradicated all traces of Spanish rule. They destroyed churches and threw themselves into rivers to wash away their Christian baptisms. "The God of the Christians is dead," Pope proclaimed, and the Puebloans resumed traditional spiritual practices. The Spanish were exiled for 12 years. They returned in 1692, weakened, to reconquer New Mexico. The late 17th century was a time of great violence and turmoil. Bacon's rebellion turned white Virginians against one another, King Philip's War shattered Native American resistance in New England, and the Pueblo Revolt struck a major blow to Spanish power. It would take several more decades before similar patterns erupted in Carolina and Pennsylvania, but the constant advance of European settlements provoked conflict in these areas as well. In 1715, the Yamasee, Carolina's closest allies and most lucrative trading partners, turned against the colony and nearly destroyed it entirely. Writing from Carolina to London, the settler George Rodd believed the Yamasee wanted nothing less than the whole continent and to kill us or chase us all out. The Yamasee would eventually advance within miles of Charlestown. The Yamasee War's first victims were traders. The governor had dispatched 2 of the colony's most prominent men to visit and pacify a Yamasee council following rumors of native unrest. The Yamasee quickly proved the fears well-founded by killing the emissaries and every English trader they could corral. The Yamasee, like many other Native Americans, had come to depend on English courts as much as the flintlock rifles and ammunition that traders offered them for enslaved laborers and animal skins. Feuds between English agents had crippled the court of trade and shut down all diplomacy, provoking the violent Yamasee reprisal. Most villages in the southeast sent at least a few warriors to join what quickly became a struggle against the colony that united various Native American peoples. Yet Charlestown ultimately survived the onslaught by preserving one crucial alliance with the Cherokee. By 1717, the conflict had largely died out, and the only remaining threat was roaming Yamasee bands operating from Spanish Florida. Most Native American villages returned to terms with Carolina and resumed trading. The lucrative trade in enslaved Native Americans, however, which had consumed 50,000 souls in 5 decades, largely dwindled after the war. The danger was too high for traders, and the colonies discovered even greater profits by importing Africans to work new rice plantations. Herein lies the birth of the Old South, that expanse of plantations that created untold wealth and misery. Native Americans retained the strongest militaries in the region, but they never again threatened the survival of English colonies. If a colony existed where peace with indigenous people might continue, it would be Pennsylvania. While William Penn and other early settlers never doubted that the English would appropriate native lands, he demanded that his colonists obtain these territories through purchase rather than violence. Though Pennsylvanians maintained relatively peaceful relations with Native Americans, immigration and land speculation increased the demand for land. Coercive and fraudulent methods of negotiation became increasingly prominent. The walking purchase of 1737 was emblematic of both colonists' desire for cheap land and the changing relationship between Pennsylvanians and their native neighbors. Through treaty negotiation in 1737, native Delaware leaders agreed to sell Pennsylvania all of the land that a man could walk in a day and a half, a common measurement used by Delawares in evaluating distances. John and Thomas Penn, joined by the land speculator and longtime friend of the Penns, James Logan, hired a team of skilled runners to complete the walk on a prepared trail. The runners traveled from Wrightstown to the present-day town of Jim Thorpe, and proprietary officials then drew the new boundary line perpendicular to the runners' route, extending northeast to the Delaware River. The colonial government thus measured out a tract much larger than the Delaware had originally intended to sell, roughly 1,200 square miles. As a result, Delaware proprietary relations suffered. Many Delaware left the lands in question and migrated westward to join Shawnee and other Delaware already living in the Ohio Valley. There they established diplomatic and trade relationships with the French. Memories of the suspect purchase endured into the 1750s and became a chief point of contention between the Pennsylvania government and the Delaware people during the upcoming 7 Years' War. Section 6 Conclusion. The century after the founding of Jamestown saw the establishment and maturation of a distinctive English imperial system. From tiny outposts on the periphery of the Atlantic world, by the early 18th century, the American colonies were large territories in a powerful British Empire. War, native expropriation, slavery, and social conflict were central to the creation of a prosperous colonial society that helped make England a global power. The settlement of 1689 established a political system ideologically premised on liberty and property, with which British American colonists strongly identified. At the same time, religious and ethnic diversity, along with novel systems of unfree labor, laid the foundation for an American society that was very different from England.